Well, hello everyone, and thank you for joining us for this, our fourth installment of our series, Stand with the Facts. I'm Kim Malcolm, the local host of All Things Considered on KUOW. And together with the Center for an Informed Public, our goal is to empower you, our audience, to be informed news consumers. We are hoping these conversations will help anyone watching to know more about what mis- and disinformation is and how it's spreading. We have a toolkit for you on how to spot misinformation and combat it in our daily lives. There's more details on that in the link to this episode. And we are taking your questions. If you are watching live, please leave them in the comments and I will get to as many of them as I can. Well, the COVID pandemic continues to unfold. The Black Lives Matter movement continues its push for equity and inclusion. And we are also in a presidential election year. So with so much changing and evolving, people are turning to the internet and social media, of course, to get more information. But how do we know that the information we're reading is factual? And how do we know if the person sharing it is consciously trying to spread disinformation or if it's just something that they actually believe? Joining me today is Kate Starbird. She's principal investigator at the Center for an Informed Public and associate professor in the Department of Human-Centered Design and Engineering at the University of Washington. Her research focuses on how online rumors spread during a crisis and how disinformation is spread through strategic information operations online. We are going to discuss her findings and what it means for you, the news consumer, when you're getting information on social media platforms. Kate, welcome.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
You bet. Well, if you don't mind, can we just start at the beginning? Because a lot of us have heard the terms bot and troll frequently, but these terms are not interchangeable, right? Can you just specify what is actually a bot and what is a troll?
Yeah, and then let me specify that we're going to talk about that in the context of misinformation and online sort of operations. But yeah, so we have three ways that misinformation spreads. And one of it is that, we spread it as people who are using online platforms. But there are also sort of intentional efforts to spread misinformation and disinformation. And one of those uses bots, which are automated accounts that an automated account, often we think about it in the context of Twitter because it's easier for them to operate there, but they operate on other platforms as well. Automated accounts that push out content. And bots work in a couple different ways, but one of their goals is to manipulate the social media platforms to make some topic look bigger than something else, or to increase the number of followers an account has, so it makes it look very influential, even though many of those accounts aren't real. And bots they operate as a group to do something together. Their content often is like copied and pasted, so it turns out not to be that individually interesting, but it works because they can use like thousands of accounts at once to try to carry out a campaign. And so that's one. Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, so they are coordinated. There's human thought behind them, but
yeah, so a bot is operated by either a computer program, and often the computer programmer is telling that bot, that set of bots, what to do. Some bots actually go back and forth and take in sort of input and act on their own. They try to use sort of machine intelligence of some kind, but most of the bots we see are pretty simple and are just a person telling this network of accounts to do something at a certain time.
Okay, so that's a bot. How about a troll? How would you distinguish them?
Yeah, so the word troll has a couple of different meanings. I think it's really important to disentangle those meanings. So for the history of the internet, or for most of the history of the internet, we've talked about trolls as people that are online, often anonymously, that are trying to get a rise out of other people. So trying to just, they're acting under a different set of social norms than we would have in real life spaces. And so they're kind of associated with some of the toxicities we see in online spaces. We also have this new definition from the last few years of a sort of based on the Russian troll kind of concept that happened in 2016, where there were these accounts that were actually operated by paid agents of, in this case, a state-sponsored disinformation campaign, but accounts that were pretending to be someone who they weren't and were in the online spaces trying to manipulate the conversation. I'm not sure that's the best term for us to use for these, but unfortunately that's the term that's picked up. So we talk about these paid trolls as part of disinformation campaigns or propaganda campaigns. And kind of a little different than the old school trolls that are just people that are out there doing their thing. These are accounts that are operated by particular organizations for a particular purpose.
Right, with a strategic intent behind them.
Exactly.
Yeah. We should also note that there's a difference between misinformation and disinformation. Can you just break down what each of those means?
Yeah, so at the highest level and the most simple level, the difference between misinformation and disinformation is intent. So misinformation is information that's false, but not necessarily intentionally so. So rumors that turn out to be false would be part of misinformation. Other kinds of mischievous things that happen, we put in the sort of the mischievous, or sorry, the misinformation bucket. But then disinformation is information that is false or misleading, and is spread or is created or spread for a strategic purpose, an objective, a political objective, a financial objective, or to grow the reputation of some kind of account or something else. And so so disinformation has that kind of intentional aspect to it. And there's also some more complex definitions of disinformation that tie it to specific kinds of propaganda campaigns that have been used in many places, but particularly innovated in the Soviet Union.
And so from a user's point of view, why is it important to know the difference between those two things?
I think for a user, it's not, let me give an example there. You know, as a researcher, we have long tried not to problematize rumors during crisis events. And for one reason, and let me give you an example. For one reason, that's because, you know, when people are dealing with a crisis event, they naturally want to come together and try to explain what's happening. They want to try to figure it out. And sometimes they get it wrong. And that becomes a false rumor. But the process of coming together to figure things out is actually not one that we want to completely stop. It serves an informational purpose. It also serves a psychological purpose. In other contexts, it's important for people to try to make sense of things that are happening, and sometimes we get things wrong. And so misinformation is a consequence of some of the normal information processes that we have. And I think to stop all misinformation would mean to stop all discourse, because it's just going to be something that happens. Now, disinformation is when someone is intentionally manipulating the space for a political or a financial objective. And that's something that I think we can individually problematize. We don't want to be manipulated. We don't want to be spreading misinformation that someone else knows is not true and is putting out there to manipulate us for some reason. And at the same time, I think the social media platforms, I think this is a big distinction for them, especially as they make policies, because they don't want to stop all conversation, and they don't want to, you know, sometimes we have differences of opinion, and the one that we all converge around turns out to be wrong. And so it's actually good to have, you know, a diversity of thought and alternate opinions about things and alternative explanations. And so I think we want to keep that going as part of the free exchange of ideas, but we don't want to allow people to take advantage of our commitment to the free exchange of ideas to manipulate us for other kinds of purposes. And so I think it's really, that distinction is important individually as we engage, but also as we think about the policies that we might want to guide these platforms where we're doing so much of our information sharing.
Right. You touched on this briefly about how people respond when there's a crisis. And this is your field of study. I mean, you look at how rumors circulate during a natural disaster, whether, you know, it's a hurricane or perhaps a pandemic, or in a man-made crisis, human-made crisis. So why do we see so many rumors and sometimes disinformation and misinformation circulating? Why does it just seem to like spiral upward during a crisis?
Yeah, crisis event just has all of these conditions that are part of the impetus for sense making, for coming together and try to explain things, and then that sense making process gives way to rumors. And so part of that is the uncertainty that a crisis event has. So we've studied a lot of natural disasters such as hurricanes and earthquakes, and in the immediate aftermath of those events, there's a lot of uncertainty about where's the damage, how many people are injured, how how are we going to travel around, because maybe there's, the roads have been disrupted, and in that kind of in that time of uncertainty, we often have an absence of official accounts, because they either don't know or they have a hard time communicating with us. And in that kind of conditions of uncertainty, we also have anxiety about how we should respond, how, the actions we should take to protect ourselves, our loved ones, our communities. And that sort of uncertainty and anxiety are known to sort of drive this sense-making process, where we try to come together, talk to our neighbors, talk to our friends, try to call someone who maybe has a different view of what's happening, if we can access the communication system, and kind of resolve that uncertainty. And that sense-making process where we come together to try to explain things, well, sometimes we get it wrong. And so we, as crisis researchers, we kind of explain misinformation as sort of false rumors that are kind of a byproduct of this sort of natural sense-making process that we experience. The thing about the pandemic is, with a lot of the disasters I've studied in the past, most of that uncertainty gets resolved very quickly. With the pandemic, we have this persistent scientific uncertainty about what is this disease, how does it spread, what are the consequences, how dangerous is it to people's health, what kind of actions can we take to mitigate the effects, what are going to be the economic effects of this or that, and we just don't know. And that persistent uncertainty is setting the conditions for this constant sort of sense making that's giving way to false rumors and misinformation. But also, we're vulnerable to that sense making process being taken advantage of others who want to exploit the situation. And we know disasters are often a time where exploiters come into the situation and try to take advantage of it for their own gain. And here we have this long period of time where they can think of different strategies, try them out, use another one, build whole narratives that feed their disinformation campaigns. And so we're particularly vulnerable after any crisis, but this crisis, because of its long extended nature, I think is one where we're acutely vulnerable to misinformation and disinformation.
Yeah, it's so interesting that you say that, because as you're speaking, I'm thinking of, from a news journalism perspective, often, when you have a crisis situation, there's the beginning, the middle, and the end. There's a certain arc, and it does tend to, it doesn't always resolve itself per se, but the intensity and the flow of the information does seem to be contained. It happens over a certain period of time. And as you say, we're in a different time now. And I'm thinking about, this pandemic and how it's affected us. When we look back on this months or years from now, I can imagine us seeing, like, there was the time before the pandemic, and then there was the time right afterwards. And I'm curious what kinds of behaviors you're seeing now online because of this COVID-19 pandemic that you may not have seen before.
It's so hard for a researcher like me to make some of these statements, because the pace at which we conduct our research, it takes years for us to really know, what we were seeing. And in fact, what's happening right now is actually putting new perspective on past events that I studied. And I didn't even quite understand what we were looking at then, and I can now see, it in new light. So I think it's going to take us a long time to fully be able to understand where that line is, and what are the changes that actually were like, this is the pandemic was part of that change, and what were the things that were already changing that this sort of brought attention to and brought a new window to look at. Certainly, a lot of the things we're seeing now in terms of spread of misinformation, disinformation, we can look in the past and see where those have similar examples of people using social media in a similar way, of disinformation, taking advantage of different platforms and different communities in similar ways. But certainly, just the scale, the number of people that are participating, I think, we've said that in other events, like we said that after Hurricane Sandy, oh my gosh, we've never seen so many people participating in a disaster event at this scale, and look at the misinformation. But this is something else, because many of us are at home, we're online most of the day, and just the activity has been pretty intense. And certainly there are things about our online environments, about how we're coming together on different platforms that are different. The platform policies that the platforms have, we've, as researchers, been begging them to put some of these policies in place to to try to dampen some of the particularly harmful kinds of misinformation and disinformation. And they've taken more actions in the last few months than we've seen them take over years. So certainly there was something that's changed there. And I think part of that change was that we as a broader community have actually recognized the phenomenon of misinformation in a way that maybe we weren't as aware of before, and it seems like the platforms think we're more willing to go along with these policies than they did a year ago when we asked for some of the same things. So I do think there is kind of a raised awareness. And I hope the last piece here, this answer is, I hope, and this is something maybe we'll get back to again, is that we realize as individuals who are using these online platforms and things, that we actually have a role in the spread of misinformation, as well as a role in the potential correction of misinformation, and therefore a responsibility. And that we're part of these systems, and that maybe if we interact with these systems differently, that we can change things. And I do think this might be one of those moments where people have an opportunity to reflect on that role and maybe change their behaviors in a way that lead to a more healthy information environment.
Well, Kate Starbird is our guest this afternoon, and we do want to hear from you, our audience. What questions do you have for Kate today? Leave them in the comments, and I will try to get to as many of them as we can. Kate, yeah, definitely lots of interest in the platforms and their policies, what may be changing. If I can, though, just briefly, I want to get back to an area as we head into this next presidential election. I want to look back just a little bit at the 2016 election when we heard about, that was when we first learned and heard the term Russian troll, many of us, for the first time. Can you tell us a little bit about the tactics you were seeing them use back then and how effective they were, and then how that compares to where we are now, 4 years later?
Yeah, so let me, perhaps I can give context by kind of taking you through one of our studies of how we encountered that. We didn't go looking for disinformation. We actually we're not studying disinformation on purpose until about 2017, when we realized that we had actually been seeing it for several years. We just didn't know what it was we were seeing. For years, we were focused on sort of online misinformation and things. And in about 2015, 2016, we began to recognize that we were seeing sort of pervasive disinformation in many of the different studies that we were doing. And then we went back and did some more systematic studies. But one of the one of the ways that we encountered disinformation was a study we were doing in 2016, actually on Black Lives Matter discourse, looking at Twitter conversations, both the community of accounts that were promoting Black Lives Matter hashtags and talking about Black Lives Matter and talking about the systemic, racism in the United States and the violence against African Americans. And then we also noted this other community that was developing that was sort of a counter Black Lives Matter movement. They were pushing Blue Lives Matter hashtags and All Lives Matter hashtags and trying to counter the message of the Black Lives Matter protesters and Black Lives Matter activists. And so we were studying this, and we actually did a long-term study of different sort of conversations that were happening. We mapped the conversation, as you can see here. We mapped it with a retweet network where we in this graph, each little dot is actually an account, and the accounts are closer together if they retweeted each other and further apart if they didn't. And what you see here is actually a structure that is very similar to a lot of conversations we get online, especially ones that are politically polarized, where most of, whether it's two parts, where there's people are mostly talking to each other and people like them. There's very little conversation in between them. And they're, we call it polarization, echo chambers, things like that. And so we were studying this conversation, and then we wrote a paper about it in 2017, published it in November. And then later that month, Twitter released a list of accounts that were associated with Russia's Internet Research Agency that had been part of their campaign to try to manipulate discourse in the United States leading up to the 2016 election. And actually, it was a longer term strategy than that. And been part of their election interference and other things. And we looked at that list of accounts, my students and I did, and we said, oh my goodness, some of these accounts look very familiar. We've seen them in our Black Lives Matter research. And so I asked my student to go back and map where those Russia's trolls, where the Internet Research Agency accounts were in these conversations. And to be honest, the first time the student sent this map to me, I said, that's not what I thought. Can you go send it back?
You questioned it. You weren't sure it was right?
I didn't think it was right. No, it's not what I wanted to see. It didn't align with my preconceived notions of what was going to happen, because we were really kind of talking about and aware at that time that, and there've been some stories about how a lot of the right-wing trolls were, well, a lot of the right-wing conversation had been supported by Russia, but what we saw here was that that the Russian trolls actually infiltrated both sides of the conversation. If you want to move to the next image, has I'm not sure if it's showing it yet or not, but it has the Russia's trolls kind of mapped in orange, and then the retweets from those accounts are little lines in the graph. And so what we actually found,
the orange on both sides, these are red.
These are retweets of the Russian troll accounts.
Okay.
Yeah, and they were
on both sides.
They were on both sides. And in other conversations, they're stronger on the right. In this conversation, what they had done was they were impersonating Black Lives Matter activists, and they had kind of infiltrated these communities, and they had slightly different strategies. In some cases, in both cases, they promoted sort of anti-media messages, turn away from Western mainstream media, go to these other alternative sites and things like that. On the right side, they were very pro-Trump, and on the left side, they were actually encouraging left-leaning voters not to vote for Hillary Clinton. So they both sort of aligned with that kind of election interference. And at the same time, many of these accounts, some of the accounts were kind of just saying messages that you would expect to see from anyone in those spaces. But in some of the cases, they were very divisive. They were spreading really hateful content. On the right, they were using racial epithets. On the left, they were advocating for violence against the police. And in some cases, we actually found Russian trolls arguing against each other to try to, so they were basically one person operating account on both sides, like a little puppeteer, enacting caricatures of us as US citizens to sort of amplify the division. They didn't create that division that we see in the graph. They didn't create the division in the United States, but they were happy to try to amplify it, use it as part of their way that they could kind of get into our conversations and then shape our political outcomes towards their goals instead of ours.
Yeah. And this was what you, looking back 4 years ago, this is what you found.
That's what we found in 2017 about the 2016 data.
Right, it's really quite something when you think about the damage that's happening in real time to public discourse, and then you're able to see it a couple of years later. So flash forward to now, we're heading into this next presidential election. Back then, the doors were wide open. The platforms, were not maybe paying attention to this or looking for it, or, the whole question of responsibility has been an ongoing one. How are they doing now? How are we set up now heading into this next political season?
In some ways, I think things are better. The platforms are definitely more aware of these operations. They're actually doing takedowns of accounts that they associate with different kinds of campaigns. Periodically, every month or two, they do a new takedown. The platforms, in some cases, working together to identify accounts, because these Twitter accounts, that Twitter conversation, it was also happening on Facebook and Reddit and other platforms as well. There's cross-platform campaigns. So platforms are doing a better job. I think people are a little bit more aware that there are accounts out there that are trying to manipulate us and get into our conversations. And so not only is it harder, especially for Russia's effort in 2016, they laid the groundwork for that starting in 2014, 2013. Some of their accounts went back further than that, but starting in 2014, it really took them a couple of years to put in place that campaign. And now they're, and no one was watching. And now, we're removing those accounts. So it's a little bit harder to get into our conversations, I think, but certainly we should expect that that there are disinformation actors out there trying to do similar things and be parts of our conversation. I want to really stress that right now, it's not Russia that I'm worried about in this space. Certainly, they're still trying to participate. We've got other countries, but lots and lots of domestic actors, people that have a different political a set of objectives than maybe your group, but they're coming into your group for whatever reason, whether it's to get you to spread misinformation, to try to delegitimize your political activism, or trying to lead you towards some kind of political end that aligns with theirs. And so I am actually more afraid of domestic actors right now than I would be of foreign actors in the disinformation space. And unfortunately, it's harder for the platforms to take action against those. It's not as easy to problematize domestic activism, even when that activism is trying to spread disinformation and manipulate other activist groups.
Yeah, that is quite something. I mean, we set up this conversation as a way to spot bots and trolls, but it sounds like what you're saying is actually perhaps a field of greater concern is just us as humans and our capacity to spread mis and disinformation all on our own.
Yeah, well, I mean, absolutely. Even behind every bot and behind every troll is a person, right?
Yeah.
And different groups have different kinds of goals, and more people are recognizing the power of using social media to achieve those goals. And some of those think about that in the way that we do, a way we want to organize and get people together on our cause. And others think about darker ways of manipulating us to achieve their ends. And it really is, I've been reading about this more and more. There's a great book out by Thomas Ridd about the history of active measures or disinformation, but this isn't new. Active measures have often taken advantage of activism or tried to blend into activism, or are hard to disentangle from activism. And so now we have this situation where we've got online activism happening, which has been amazing, how people can come together and meet other people that share their values and organize in ways. And we've been just celebrating that for a decade now. At the same time, this has allowed disinformation actors to see that as an opportunity for them to using their own old tactics, but in new ways through new tools to try to bend our activism towards their goals.
Yeah. I don't know if you know the answer to this question, but when you talk about domestic groups manipulating the space politically, are they using tools like bots themselves?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, some of the bots we found spreading disinformation in 2016 that intersected with some of the Russian disinformation we were studying in another project. They were run by U.S. citizens. For whatever reason. Sometimes it was a financial reason. Sometimes, they were trying to boost their account so their account could do something else. We can think of other cases where they may be coordinating with foreign campaigns, and it's hard to disentangle all of that. But certainly, bots are not a foreign thing. People, anyone can create a bot. Anyone with a first year of computer science education can create a bot on Twitter.
So there have been some questions that have been sent in, and so this might be a good time to put this in. I'm not sure who sent this in, but thank you for your question for sending it. How do you recognize a bot? Can you, just from what you're seeing?
So bots are a little bit easier to recognize than trolls. What I would do to recognize a bot is if something looks a little strange, or it looks like its messages are a little bit I don't even want
the syntax is a little messed up. Okay.
Yeah, but the syntax, a human can program a bot. They just say what it is. But what I might do is I might copy the content of a tweet, and I will search for it on either Twitter or on Google, or maybe I'll copy like 5 or 6 words from that tweet in a row and see if there are many other accounts tweeting the same thing. If it's a retweet, that's one thing, but if it's many accounts copying and pasting the same content, that's one way to recognize it. In terms of just recognizing sort of an account associated with a disinformation campaign, whether it's a bot or a troll, one of the things I do on Twitter, before I retweet, before I follow, and on Facebook, I don't follow anyone I don't know, but on these other platforms, I think this is a good idea too. But for Twitter, before I retweet or follow anyone, I go look at that profile. I go look not just at their last 3 tweets, I scroll down. What are they tweeting about this week? What did they tweet about last week? And what did they tweet about a few months ago? I look at that content. If I don't want to endorse, if there's anything in that content I don't want to endorse, then I don't want to retweet or follow that account. Because what can happen is someone takes your retweet as an endorsement, they end up following the account you retweeted, and all of a sudden you've allowed somebody into one of your followers' ecosystems. And one of the things we know about disinformation strategies is 90% will be true, and 90% will be what you want to hear and what you want to believe, and then 10% is their strategic stuff. And so somebody will send out an account send out a tweet that appeals to you about some topic, and you'll retweet it, and then you're giving an endorsement, and you don't realize that that's part of a longer strategy. That's how those accounts infiltrated the Black Lives Matter discourse and the Blue Lives Matter discourse, is they just said things that other people were saying. They got some retweets, and then people said, oh, they're part of our group, and they began to follow it. And once a few of your friends follow an account, then it looks like, oh, a lot of my friends are following that account, I should follow it too. So I think we really have to be careful before we give that endorsement to another account, to really kind of see who it is that we're endorsing. And I know we all say retweets don't equal endorsements, but they do. They really do. They do, both to the people that are seeing your content and to the algorithms, the systems, how the systems recommend things. Your retweets and your follows actually collectively, they make a difference. I try to use this connection to voting. We all may think like, I only get one vote. What is it going to do? Is it really going to change things? But if everybody thinks that and everyone stays home, then certainly it does change things. Well, similar on social media. If, yeah, it's only one little action, you're only one little user. But if everybody decides to be a little bit more careful, if everybody decides to correct themselves when they're wrong or correct others when they see false information, then we actually can make a change at a systemic level. And so really kind of think about, that we do have a role, we do have agency, we can make change, and that we have responsibility in these spaces.
It's so interesting you talk about the power of the individual. We got this question from, it's either Nell or Nellie. Nellie, forgive me if I'm saying this incorrectly, sending this to us from YouTube. And she says, and I think she's talking for quite a few people here, this issue makes me feel so powerless. I just stopped using Facebook products altogether. Does boycotting on an individual level do more to help or hurt in holding companies accountable?
It's such a hard question. I abandoned Facebook for 3 years.
You did. What pushed you to abandon it?
Combination of reasons. One was this. I was mad at the company for the things that they were doing. I felt like I didn't want my being there to hold other people to being there. I'm creating content that other people may want to follow, and if I backed away, then if we all back away, then then we might have an impact. I came back 6 months ago. Actually, no, I came back right with the pandemic because I thought, okay, I have a voice, I have things to say. What I have to say might be useful to people, and hopefully I can make a bigger change through saying something than through not being there. What we're learning more recently, that individually it's very hard for us to make a difference on these policies. Even if we all collectively decide to leave, it turns out that not everyone collectively decides to leave, and it's hard. And a lot of us are tied there now. Our social connections are there. There's party. I mean, I miss.
We can't quit it. We can't quit your Facebook.
I miss parties in my family. They were like, "Why didn't you show up?" I was like, "Where was I supposed to see it?" Well, I put it on Facebook. I'm like, "I'm not on Facebook. What am I?" So, and that was my siblings, right? Like,
right.
it's hard. It's hard to get away. But when advertisers have pulled, as the advertisers have pulled away from Facebook, they're actually thinking about making some changes. And I think that's almost more important, is to talk to the other companies that we're a part of, and also our policymakers, our government. We're supposed to be a democracy. A democracy doesn't mean that everything goes, and it doesn't mean that the government controls everything. It means that we as citizens should be helping to make the decisions that govern our lives. And right now, these platforms have so much power in our lives. And so I think that's another avenue of trying to make change. But I recognize it's really hard for us to leave those platforms as much as we might like to.
Yeah. This is a legal question that's been touched on before. To talk about, keeping the platforms accountable. This question is there any legal action the US can take to stop bots and or trolls?
Yeah, so this is not my area of expertise, but I do know that we have had some very interesting changes being made. And one of those has happened in the state of California, who they decided that they were going to pass laws that applied to citizens of California, but that meant that if the platforms were serving citizens of California, then they would have to make these changes. And I think they've been continuing on that route to make some changes. And I think they've made changes around how bots had to be signaled or something along those lines. I'm not sure how well the platforms or the people that use them are in compliance, but certainly there's been some efforts to enact some laws to make those changes. We haven't seen a lot happen at the federal level. And honestly, I think a lot of us are a little bit nervous about what changes might be made.
What would make people nervous?
I think, well, so let me give a comparison. In China, there are a lot of social media platforms that they're not allowed to use US-based social media platforms. They're only allowed to use certain platforms that are often working together with the state. And those platforms have rules, they punish people for spreading misinformation, for instance. And they have some other harsh policies. And so we can actually see some of that. Many of us historically have seen that very problematically, as in the governments are working together with the platforms to spread certain kinds of propaganda and not allow people to have certain kinds of discourse, kind of to maintain authoritarian control of a country. We're seeing similar policies go into place in like Hungary, put in a policy about spreading misinformation that could be used to punish people for spreading things that were challenging the state, and similar things. So we can actually see if a state goes too far to put into policies, they could actually use that to reaffirm their power, and the platforms could sort of become part of a state that is increasingly authoritarian. And so there is a risk there on the policy side. So as we think about how to put policies in place and who should be doing it and how it should be done, I think there's some really hard questions there for all of us. And it's not my area of expertise, so I can't say much more.
Yeah, it is in people's minds though. Bernadette got in touch with us on YouTube, and she was talking about misinformation and disinformation and how that's defined. And she's saying, is there a danger of political bias silencing under the guise of misinformation, and which seems to be perhaps.
Absolutely, there is, and that's one of the things that makes it very difficult for the platforms to put in policies, and that makes it very, very difficult, even as researchers, of what we might recommend, because a policy in one context that makes a lot of sense around, okay, let's not let people spread misinformation about COVID-19 because that could cause, it could cause harm. Well, if that policy was actually based on bad science, for instance, the early recommendations that people not buy masks, you could actually see that a case where the platforms are enforcing policies that align with a particular political or other entity that turn out not to be misinformation, because sometimes it turns out that the alternative information is true. And that's why we actually want to have support a diversity of ideas. And at the same time, think about how that support for diversity of ideas is enabling actors that want to take advantage of it to do certain kinds of things. So how do we differentiate between open-minded discourse trying to go somewhere and these sort of like strategies to manipulate conversations towards particular political objectives? It's hard, it's really messy.
It is messy, and it seems to me, I mean, as we're dealing with this pandemic, we're heading into what will surely be another very divisive presidential election. People are craving information, factual information. They're looking for it in all different areas. And I guess I'm wondering, we've seen more, because people are craving it, they're dissatisfied with the experience they're having on the platforms, and the misinformation they're getting, the hate speech they're seeing. There's more pressure being placed on the platforms. They're, as you say, they're responding in ways now that they haven't in years. They're labeling some tweets, they're fact checking things. At this point, is it enough? Do you think it's enough where we're at?
Well, misinformation, disinformation is still spreading. So clearly we could do better. Yeah, no, I mean, there's a lot we can do better. And I think we should think about that on a couple of different levels. And one of those, we talked a little bit about policy already. We talk a little bit about the platform policies and what they're doing, but I'm actually kind of more of a proponent of things that the platforms can do to help us make better decisions. So not necessarily taking content out, but helping us understand where content came from, how it got to us, who are these accounts, how do they give us more information about these accounts that we see so we can make a better decision about whether to follow them or friend them or reshare their content of whatever it is. How can you, when I see something on Facebook, can you tell me how my friend got it, who then shared it with me? And then I can maybe make a better decision about where it comes from. Can we give better signals about the websites that are being cited? We know information about these websites. There's a lot of ways that we can, say this is higher quality, this is lower quality, and this is really a hyper-partisan site that's constantly putting out disinformation. We could give those signals to people in ways that it's, at least for people that are still open-minded and trying to do the right thing, they could make better decisions. But right now, if I went to Twitter and I see a tweet, and I've never followed this person before, I've never seen them before, and I press retweet, it just retweets. It doesn't tell me that I don't know who this person is. It doesn't tell me that if I go see something with a link and I retweet it, it just retweets. It doesn't check if I've read what's in that link. It doesn't, and there's a lot of ways. All they had to do to make this a little better would be say, hey, just bring up another window and say, before you retweet this, as you said you wanted to, but before you retweet this, look at this information about this author. So it would lower the amount of content being shared, which is one of the reasons these platforms haven't necessarily taken some of these actions, because they've been optimizing on engagement. But if they slowed our sharing down a little bit, we could actually create a more healthy environment that may have, in the long term, be better for the platforms and society as a whole, right? So there's things that they could do better. And I know they're working on things and they're thinking about things, but there's a lot of things I think we could do better just to give ourselves more agency in the decisions we make, and sort of be better informed about how we're interacting. And then also I think there's education opportunities. That's why we're having this conversation today. That's why we do the research we do, is how do we help people better understand these systems and our roles within these systems. And I think there has been this, people are aware of the problem, which is not true of 4 years ago. So people are more aware of the problem. Maybe people were increasingly aware in 2016, but right now with the pandemic, in the wake of 2016, I think we're acutely aware that these problems are out there. And I think the next thing to do is to come up with better strategies that we can tell people so they don't feel overwhelmed. They actually feel empowered in interacting with these systems, like they know what they can do to make things better. And I hope that we can keep working on that and putting messages out there that don't cause people to just like, I have to turn it all off, but actually give people constructive things that they can do to make these information spaces healthier.
Kate, I've got a question for you. It's a perennial question through this series. We've been getting some version of this question, so now it's your turn. People are pretty passionate right now and combative sometimes if you engage with someone online and you're pointing out misinformation. Any tips from you on that delicate conversation that you have with a friend or a family member or a colleague that maybe they don't have all the facts?
Yeah, this is so hard, and it's one of those do as I say, not as I do, because I have my family members and I'm in constant, conversation and all these other things.
Darn it, Kate, I've asked all of you folks in the series so far and none of you say this is easy.
Yeah, no, it's not, there's no easy. If we had an easy do these 1, 2, 3 things, it would be done. We'd all have learned the rules and we would know how to do it. It's hard, but let me give you a few things that maybe will be encouragement. A few years ago, we had this idea that there was a backfire effect and that we were telling people not to correct people. We're throwing that out. It turns out that finding is very contextual. It doesn't seem to play out in a lot of different contexts, and corrections are far more beneficial than they are harmful. And so we really are telling people to correct yourself when you do something wrong. Don't just delete the tweet or hide the post or whatever. go back and edit it to let everyone you know that you now know it's misinformation. If someone's reshared it, go tell them that, you know what, I was wrong about that. Maybe you want to do this correction too. On Facebook, you can edit a post, edit that thing at the top and the bottom to say, this turned out to be not true. I'm so sorry. Please let your friends know, etc. For correcting others, the best corrections are empathetic, not confrontational if you can. To let someone know, I can understand why you think that, but it turns out not to be true. Cite sources that you can point them to. They're not always going to trust your sources, but try to cite, credible sources as you do that, and hopefully that'll make a change. Family members or close ties, it's easier to correct from family members or close ties than it is to someone you don't know. They're pretty much going to reject your correction. And to, understand that not all corrections are going to work. And also online, you're not just correcting the person who shared it, you're telling everyone else who sees that content that there's something wrong there. And so recognize that it's not your message, yes, you want to tell that, you want to be right and you want them to understand you're right. And I know that's a psychological thing, but sometimes we have to just think, we're not really communicating this because of the person on top that's shared it. We're communicating this for the audience and all the other people that see it. And so really think about your engagement as an educational opportunity for other people seeing the content, with the idea that the person who probably shared it is never going to acknowledge that they changed their mind. And also the last one is, very few people are going to acknowledge their mistake in that moment, but it may change their behavior in the future. And so even if they won't acknowledge that you're right and they still leave it up there and everything else, they may be less likely to share information or misinformation like that in the future. So again, I think we need to get behind new norms of corrections with empathy, and corrections with this idea that it's a crowd correction rather than as an individual correction.
Kate, I've just got a little bit time left with you, and it strikes me that coming to you and talking about this misinformation, disinformation, there's so much of it out there. The platforms feel very wide open, although that may be shifting. There's a lot of bad news out there. It's a very negative. It can feel very heavy and negative, and as Nellie was saying, it makes us feel powerless at times.
Yeah.
I've heard you say that you hope people don't give up on it. And I think what you meant was conversing on social media. Why do you say that? What good do you see in it?
Okay, this is hard. So let me give you a little bit of background. My first research on social media was about all the pro-social things that people do during disaster events, how they use social media to come together and help each other and try to organize volunteer efforts. During the pandemic, we saw people use social media to find masks and get those to first responders and medical responders. And so we've seen all of these these great potentials of social media. And in recent years, our hopefulness about it has been replaced by this recognition of all these toxicities. And at times I'm ready to throw the whole experiment out and just say, let's just not use them. But then kind of think about what it would be like to be experiencing this pandemic without online tools to talk to people. I think it'd be really difficult for us. I think that's half the reason we've been surviving so well, considering all of the social distancing that's been happening. And at the same time, they're not going away. It's not all going back into Pandora's box or whatever. This is out there and it's going to happen. And so with that being out there, I'm afraid that all the good people will get fed up and leave and just leave all of the shenanigans and the people trying to spread misinformation, harassment, and hate, and that we'll push all the good people out of the public sphere, and we'll just have all these toxicities that remain. And I'm worried about that. And so I guess I'm encouraging those of us who care enough and feel that, who feel that kind of, who recognize the negatives here, to not give up on it, because if we do, we're just ceding the whole public sphere to the toxicities.
Kate Starbird, leaving us with some hope today, and I so appreciate that. Take responsibility and be kind and have hope. I think if I've got that right. Kate,
Yeah.
so much for those.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, and thanks for the great questions.
Kate Starbird is Principal Investigator at the Center for an Informed Public and Associate Professor at the Department of Human-Centered Design and Engineering. From everyone at KUOW and our partner, the Center for an Informed Public, thank you so much for joining us today with Stand with the Facts. We do have a toolkit for you. You can visit kuow.org/facts to access the toolkit. And there's a link and resources on spotting misinformation and how to address it. Next time, we're going to be talking on Tuesday, July 21st at 1 in the afternoon with Chris Coward. He and I are going to be discussing resources the community can use to stop the spread of misinformation. And you can register for that event and also see past events at kuow.org/facts. Everybody, thank you so much. Thank you for your great questions and joining us today, and we will see you next time.